Outer Orange.
There's Derek Dow. So if you want to check out this video for yourself, don't worry, I got you. But that's the video, so give us some love. Baro is happening literally this weekend. I'll be commentating it. So I kind of wanted to discuss with you guys today, not necessarily what decks are coming, but sort of how to fight some of these decks. Derek Dow did top 10 decks you'll see here. So I'm going to kind of go over with you guys kind of what to do to deal with these decks. And this is just very basic and casual stuff. So obviously, like if you're playing a specific deck, it may not portray to you because not every deck has access to certain tools, but you can at least kind of be careful sort of like what to do against these decks. So that's kind of what I'm gonna go over today. So I'm gonna use the same top 10 decks that Derek Dow claims is going to be on Baro. I don't disagree with him, by the way. I think the 10 decks he provided here is probably the 10 decks we'll see. As you guys can see, one of the main decks that we'll probably be seeing is Kyrie. Kyrie is extremely popular. Will be a very likelihood that if you enter Baro and you're going to standard and you're going in, you'll probably see at least one Kyrie deck. There will be at least one, because not only is this deck good to play, but it's also insanely popular right now. Everyone is taking it. There's different variants of it, but they all kind of do the same thing, something to keep in mind. So how do you fight one of the best decks in standard right now? How do you do it? There's kind of multiple ways you can approach this. I'd say the number one and probably best way to do it is to just constantly rush them down. You can rush them down. That's number one. So your goal, if you go first, you can try to rush them down and try to get them to not get to grade 4. If your deck is not capable of doing that, you do have other options. Get rid of their melties. So if you see that they call out melties and they don't bounce them, if they have a melty on the board, I highly recommend swinging into it, as it kind of slows down the pace of the deck a little bit, especially early on. If they're calling them out and not bouncing them, it's a good way to kind of approach. Be cautious of the top card, the alien, the one that says that puts cards on top or not. If you kind of know that there may be a trigger coming, it may not be a bad idea to try and guard that if you don't want to take that early damage, to keep yourself at a good healthy damage to deal with their grade 4 turn. That is something else. So you kind of have like a couple approaches here. Don't deny that she doesn't spam that much counterblast, so you might as well rush the deck down. They're probably gonna take the damage anyway because they need the cards in their hand to kind of deal with what they're doing. I will say this deck gets harder and harder to deal with as the turns go and go. So your best bet is to rush them down, but if you can't, then you have other options. So you can live through their grade 4 turn and then kill them on your grade 4 turn if you're going towards the grade 4 route. But this deck is definitely one of those decks where you want to kill it off as fast as possible. Retire is another good alternative, as it forces them to have to call more cards from hand, or they forces them to have to go into melty. I play a pretty semi-retire heavy deck, so usually if I just keep retiring their main key pieces, and then what happens is they either start falling behind, or they'll just gradually start just falling off, or they won't have enough hand to deal with my big turns. So that's another approach. So if you have any form of retire, that really helps against decks like this. The Friends engine or not the Friends engine doesn't really matter too much, as both decks, whether you play more pure, you play more like this version, both decks kind of do this thing where they just gain pretty decent numbers, and they're kind of like awkward guard numbers where it forces you to have to guard a certain way. This is Gravidia. So Gravidia is actually a very wonderful deck to take right now. I actually consider this to be one of the best decks in the format. I think it's actually better than current Kyrie, and for multiple reasons. This deck has better matchups aside from mirror matches, but this deck has better matchups into other decks than other decks do. So I personally think like this into Kyrie is like perfect, because you're constantly board wiping them. It's really hard for them to keep up. So another thing, this deck has insanely good pressure. This is a grade 3 focus deck. I think grade 3 focus decks are like insanely solid because they have persona over grade 4 decks. They can kind of kill before you get a chance to ride to grade 4. So I personally think that's why this deck is actually more superior to Kyrie. Now, a couple things about Gravidia. So Gravidia is a very aggressive deck, and it requires pretty much one counterblast to do its full combo, but keep in mind that most people want World, so you can actually force some early denial. You can stop their aggressive turn 2 play by not giving a counterblast. I know that's weird to say in a format where it feels like that's not that important, but actually slowing them down, forcing that counterblast off early is good. And keep in mind, Gravidia players do not run a counterchargers nowadays. Most do not run Boba Mine or the grade 3, so you actually can force out the counterblast out of them. You can actually force it that way they don't have a really good turn 2, because the lower you're at damage early on, the better it is for you. You don't want them freely rushing you down on turn 2, so it's really good to deny this deck on grade 2. In my opinion, I think it's good to just not give them the grade 2 skill. Let them search out their card, do whatever, but don't let them rush you down on that very same turn, because keep in mind the grade 2s can be called on the board. They can have the on hits apply. They can put the shield token behind the grade 2 that has the on hit, and you don't really want to like let them repel that fast and kind of start steamrolling you. You kind of want to ease into it. So it's an approach. I actually prefer the pure for this very reason, because if you play pure, oh, thank you, Sim, welcome in. Welcome in. They scare you? Oh no. BRO standard. Prison and meteors scare me. Aw. Welcome in, Sim. Thanks for the 4 months. I appreciate it. Thanks for sticking around. But yeah, so this deck is honestly, how do I put it? It's a very hard deck to out-tempo, as their tempo is really good, especially if the player knows what they're doing. Pure has a bigger beatdown. You can actually early rush Pure if you do see Pure, since you don't have to think about their counterblast as much, since they're kind of just do their own thing. Pure, the biggest fear you have is them deck thinning fast enough to where the deck will be more triggers than like everything else, and that's like your biggest fear. Perfect guards are definitely something you want to farm for. If your deck has any form of draw, utilize it to its maximized power. This includes if you're a Kyrie player, you want to use as much draw as possible to find perfect guards as quickly as possible. Perfect guards will be your friend against this deck, because if you can shut down the main aggression, which is the Vanguard, and deal with their lethal turns, then you'll be okay, because there's only so many times they can persona ride, right? So, and they have to find those personas. So if you can kind of start tempoing them out when they're not on persona turns, or when they're on their first grade 3 turn, you can kind of have like the upper hand. But this is a very tempo deck, and you have to tempo out kind of with them, so you have to be very careful when you're putting down perfect guards, when you're not. Sometimes it's good to watch what they're doing and kind of follow along with it. If they're not dropping meteors, maybe you should be dropping perfect guards. You know, you just have to be kind of very careful, like pretty much your guarding really matters. When you drop perfect guards versus when they're meteoring is very important. Especially World doesn't usually drop 5 meteors every single time. They'll usually kind of tempo out the game a little bit more, which is good for you because it leaves you more room to be able to hold on to your perfect guards, and maybe 2 to pass sometimes, or 3 to pass, whatever you can do, because the numbers do get kind of high. Rear guards are very whatever, by the way. Screw the rear guards, like you swing into those, like they're not really doing too much. The mid focus is always Vanguard. The rear guards get pretty high if they have retire. Something to keep in mind, the octopus thing, this grade 3 right here, only gets its crit if you retire 3 things on the board, so that's something to keep in mind. So you may want to play the vanilla game, maybe only call out 2, so that way they're not forced to ever have the crits. You don't want the crit on this, especially on a persona turn with 5 meteors. The crit gets very lethal very fast, so your best approach to that is to maybe be careful how you're calling out your rear guards. Maybe don't put boosters down, use that as for something else. 11 normal units that are not part of ride line, so eventually they'll run out of normal units, and if you keep swinging into them, or if you have any form of retire, this will be in your benefit. And it is not an easy deck to counteract. Sometimes it can just kill you even at 1 damage. OT is very scary under this deck. So here we have Nirvana. Now this deck, actually, I don't have as much information for you guys, at least with the new stuff. So the Nirvana has a superior ride engine now. To be fair, I am not fully aware how impactful it is. I hear it's very strong. I hear the superior ride is very good. I watched a couple of videos on this. I haven't faced anyone with the superior ride engine in mind, so for this specific topic, my knowledge may not be as solid. However, so that's but yeah, you can ping for damage, so you can actually ride the grade 4, use the skill, and then use the Amelia to ride again, and then you can ping for damage that way. So that is something to kind of be cautious of. Keep in mind that is something they can do, so you have to be really prepared. This is a very pressure deck. This deck has a lot of really good numbers, a lot of really good pressure. So your goal, I think, as a player is to just like really cautionize on how you guard, because their numbers are very specific. Guarding is important. I think perfect guards are also very useful against this matchup as well, as their numbers do get kind of chaotic. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing to kind of be cautious of is how many of these cards are kind of out, because they do get these cards back. Yeah, I think watching your pace is insanely important. This deck is kind of risky bisky. I do think it falls apart very fast depending on how you pressure them. I've noticed personally as when I play against this deck is that normally their hand is cluttered with grade 3s and grade 4s, and that's a good thing for me. So I can just kind of be faced. There's been a lot of times where they have like an 8 card hand and I'm thinking, oh, they're fine. And then I swing into them and then they say no guard. And then they show me their hand and it's just grade 3s and 4s. And there's been definitely drive checks that I've seen. They go triple drive and they go grade 4, grade 4, grade 3, and I'm like, oh well, you're kind of dead next turn. I think retire isn't too terrible into this. I know that there's kind of a way that they can unbrick it and all that kind of stuff, like they can just get it back from drop back to the board and stuff like that, but I do still think retire isn't terrible. It kind of forces them to have to find more units to do what they want to do. So swinging into stuff isn't usually a bad thing as long as the base power is normal and not like a crazy number. Perfect guards are very useful. You know, they do have a restander. The restander, keep in mind the restander is only going to be like 23. It's the second attack that's going to be pretty lethal, so you always want to guard for that one.
Welcome
Ian, thank you for the sub. Thank you so much. Welcome in, thank you. This is, I like how we just have Derek down in the background this entire time. But anyway, so here we have prison. So this is prison. This is normal stuff. They did get a couple new cards, so let's kind of talk about sort of what to do against this deck. I feel like a lot of people really fear this deck, and they have reason to. This deck can randomly ramp up really badly. I think this deck has a hit or miss. There is times where they see everything they need to see, and they just pop off like crazy. They get their Makaratis or whatever their name is, and they get this girl and they get this girl, and they kind of just go insane. And then there's times where they just don't see any of that, and they just kind of do nothing for a couple turns. So it's just kind of 50-50 sometimes. But I think your biggest thing is you want to beat them down, but you also want to knock out their rear guards as you're doing it. You want to really utilize the prison. The prison is a two-way street. Essentially, you are getting stuff locked into your prison, but you can also use that utility to your deck. So this one's gonna be the hardest for me to explain how to play around this, because it just depends on the kind of deck you're playing. But I'll give it kind of a couple like kind of little bits and pieces. A good example is if you're playing Nirvana, you can give them the grade 4, and then you can use that grade 4 to then restand, so essentially giving extra attacks. That's one approach. Another approach is on-place abilities. PBO has a bunch of on-place abilities. Something to keep in mind, you can flip the game really fast by using the prison to your advantage. Also may want to utilize the prison's costs over the cost of your cards. So for example, if you have a main and say you don't have the counterblast for it, but you want to just get out of the prison, just counterblast, get out of the prison with something else, and just don't use the counterblast for the main. Like, it's just something you got to think about. Of course, there are different situations. Sometimes you may want the main skill in this case, sometimes you may not. But sometimes it's good to just get the stuff out of prison and just play your game vanilla. Just play vanilla. You know, Soul is obviously a lot easier to use, so your Soul Blast skills you can kind of use between the prison and your abilities, so just, you know, do that. But I think just beating this deck down as fast as possible is the way to go. They usually don't have a great hand, and they'll usually struggle a little bit, and their pieces like are very important to do what they want to do. Yes, the insult crits are amazing. They work really well because you can keep recursioning them. They're going to keep taking them. You're going to keep using them, and it's just kind of like a recursion system. This girl right here, you may want to knock her out or keep the prison at 2 so that we don't have to worry about. There will come a point, there's kind of like a tipping point. There'll come a point where they'll start out prisoning you, and that's really dangerous. When you get at that point, you have to start finding another way to just kind of kill as fast as possible. You don't want to get to that breaking point. That's when they start winning, that's when the tide kind of starts shifting their way. So you want to out-tempo the prison as much as possible. If there comes a point where you can't, well, then you just have to start going all in, start going for your win con, start figuring something out. I want to talk about this card right here. I would be very cautious of this card. This card, when you're at 5 damage, is very scary, as this increases the prison really fast. This card pretty much says anytime you were to guard against her attack, it pretty much goes into the prison instead. So this is a very, very scary card. They can kind of attack in a certain pattern that forces you to have to guard this card specifically. They can put crits on it to kind of force you to have to guard it. So be cautious of when this card's on the board. I do think this is actually a really good card. I don't think this is too playable, but I do think this is insanely playable. So definitely a card to look out for. Bastion. So here's Bastion. Bastion honestly hasn't changed too much. If you have faced Bastion at all in the last like couple of months, you should have a somewhat understanding of how to fight this deck. This deck is pretty much you just gotta survive their big blow and kill them back. Hope that they have a ton of grade 3s in hand, and they have less of this card in hand to kind of deal with their blows. You can just also rush the deck down pretty smoothly and just not really fear too much. This matchup is pretty, I think, standard in my opinion. Like, there really isn't any tactic. You just gotta play the game. Baro Magnus. So Baro Magnus is, in my personal opinion, one of the most annoying matchups to probably face. I think this matchup is god-awful. Anyway, so here we have Baro the Magnus, the homie. I think this is one of the hardest decks to play around. I would even argue this deck is almost unplay-aroundable. But I think the biggest thing is you can rush down Baro, but watching them heal literally wins them the game. The more turns they have, the closer you are to dying, in my opinion. So yeah, rushing down is definitely the go. But I just want to keep in mind, this deck is just kind of a wild card deck. Sometimes they just auto win, and it's just awful. I don't know what to say about this deck. It's Baro Magnus. They have a huge soul charge. You can't deny the soul charge. If they hit their nuts, they hit their nuts. Hope you have a perfect guard. I would honestly usually take the first Vanguard swing, whatever their first Vanguard swing is. I would take it actually, so that way you're at higher damage, they can't heal. Because healing is actually super, super big in this deck. Them healing is like insane. I've always seen games turn around aggressively. Like usually the Baro Magnus player will actually be losing, and then they heal back down to 2-3 damage, and suddenly they're winning, and it sucks. And you don't want that happening. So usually you might want to take some of the damages. You know, I selfishly Vanquish Engraver is another thing you can kind of play around a little bit. If they're getting close to deck out, you can actually force the on hit to happen, and haha hee hee, they deck out. I've actually done that before. But here we have buff Sagara. I don't know if we'll actually see this deck too much. Yeah, this card definitely kind of adds on a little bit. You can pretty much call out Great Wonder West from drop to rear, so you can call your trick moves out a little bit faster. I think Bob is the one you should fear the least, and the one you'll probably see the least. You should still be careful of the deck. I think you just gotta, it's another deck where you need perfect guards in. You really want to make sure you can perfect guard their Vanguard. Their rear guards are usually extremely small. Rear guards won't be that scary. They will be board wiping you, by the way. The Eugene support does kind of help them with like board wiping them. They'll pretty much wipe your front, and then they'll wipe a rear guard in the back too. Brucinator, the Brucey boy. So Bruce has there's 2 ways to fight Bruce. 2 ways. Well, 2 main ways. And it depends on if they run the grade 4 or not. The grade 4 changes how you battle this deck by quite a bit versus the grade 3 engine. The grade 3 engine is pretty much very lethal once they persona ride with all their combos. The grade 4 is also lethal, but in its own way. So it's kind of up to you how you want to early guard. You definitely want to rush this deck down. Be very mindful of Leonard. Under grade 4 Bruce, you want to be at lower damage because the OTK is just insane in that deck. You also need a perfect guard, but it will take a couple turns for it to kind of get there, so you have time. Persona has more options, and I find less bricks. Yeah, they're both kind of, they both have different win cons. So the grade 4 win con is I hit you for 5 crits and hope to kill you on this turn, and my numbers are unguardable. But they were actually pretty much unguardable, and Quinn lose another option, right? So that's grade 4 Bruce. Grade 3 Bruce is numbers are a little bit more guardable, and I'm getting a scam likely call. Numbers are a little bit more guardable, but you have to be, but it's more attacks essentially. So that being said, you know, with grade 3 Bruce, I think having like actual generic shield is good. And grade 4 Bruce, you just want to get perfect guards out for the Vanguard attack at least, and then, you know, try and hard guard the rear guards. You want to make sure you never put a booster behind your Vanguard, or be very careful, or have it self-retire or something, because if they want to poke your Vanguard, Leonard poking Vanguard is just so perfect sometimes because there is the double a hit. Like you will usually want to take a damage at some point because you want counterblast, right? So if you have a booster behind, you're pretty much giving them 2 shots at doing whatever they want to do. So usually having boosters in a certain way, you want to be very careful how you're calling out your boosters. You don't really want to give them that 2 soul. You don't really want to give them that double ping for their Leonard skills. So just be very cautious kind of how you're setting up your board. If stuff self-retires or anything like that, that's good for you. Makes it a little bit easier to deal with it. So that's pretty much the big thing. Derek is another card to be cautious of. Derek does refill their board depending on how much open rear guards there are. So, you know, just be careful of kind of how you're maintaining your board setup. Next we have Flagberg. A deck that you would think would never show sightings, but here it is. It is showing sightings. This is actually the Flag Order Burger Boat edition. Very similar to how I've been running my builds, with the exception of this grade 2 right here. But I do like this guy. This guy pretty much self-retires, gets something 10k. But anyway, so let's talk about Burger Boat. So Burger Boat has been kind of under the water for a while. Now he's rising up, and a lot of people are actually playing this deck now because this deck is just... it's just a strong deck. Honestly, playing around this deck is the best way to play around this deck is to be careful how much counterblast you give them. However, sometimes you're kind of forced into giving them CB, and retiring them won't really do too much because they can revive their stuff with Soap Body Condensation down here. If they go first, you don't want to give them 3 counterblast because they can spam it with Ascendance Assault, and you can actually watch yourself go from whatever your damage at to 6 pretty quickly because they can just do this. And then they can attack with Vanguard. It's very costly at counterblast, but they can do it and they can actually kill you. If you don't see defenses, you will actually just straight die. So you want to be very careful. Kind of, I would stay at 2 counterblast intervals. Kind of force them to have to use the counter charger. You know, do whatever. Early on, their mulligan is pretty rough. They sometimes when they're discarding, they have a lot of pieces that they kind of need in hand. Specifically the inlet, the counter charger, and the Ascendance Assault. Usually 9 out of 10 times they'll be discarding the orders or the counter charger guide because they want to see Ascendance Assault. They want to have inlet pulse, right? So those are their main cards. So sometimes it's kind of hard to discard or hard to discard for your ride. So be very cautious, watch what they're discarding. It'll usually give you a good idea of like sort of what's in their hand. In terms of guarding, you want to kind of make a decision the minute they start attacking. Look at their board state. Do they have a Sense of Assault and inlet on the board? Okay, cool. They can go for the 5 attacks. Their attack pattern does matter. Sometimes they'll start with Vanguard first if they're changing things up. So something to kind of keep in mind. Usually you want to make a decision at the beginning. You either take all the rear guards and hard guard the Vanguard, or you guard all the rear guards cards and take the Vanguard. So you really need to make that decision like right then on the spot, and either one will either punish you or go for you. It just depends on what your damage is at. Kind of depends on your situation. If you're a 5 damage, you're kind of screwed. You're forced to guard everything, especially if they're a persona. So yeah, just this deck is steamrolls really fast. It takes grade 4 decks out pretty quickly. My homie PBO here. PBO, what a lovely deck. What a beautiful deck. Peanut butter, guys. It's the goat sama. Ren Booba. Here it is, Peanut Butter Overlord. This deck's really solid. You can't deny this deck. You can deny draw. You can deny like early on a little bit with the twin drive, but you really can't stop anything else. This deck is just gonna keep doing its thing. Like no matter what you do, it's gonna do what it wants to do. So that's why this deck is actually in a really good spot right now, because there really is no like mega counterplay. I will say, you know, if they have rear guards on the board and you swing into them and they're holding more triggers than not, then that will kind of help them, kind of help you a little bit. But one tactic is to just not give them the counter blast for Blaster Dark's Vanguard skill. That's one approach that some people do. I don't know how helpful it is or not, because I've seen both ends where it's helped the opponent, and then I've seen the other end where it just did absolutely nothing and I still won the game. But it is a tactic that some people do. They just deny that early. I guess as a Bruce player, you know, that's the one thing you definitely want to usually do. You usually don't want them popping your starter. So however, if you don't deny them, they're going to go pretty aggressive. This grade 1 right here is actually insane. There's also a grade 2 that kind of does something similar. It requires no counterblast at all to do PBO's main skill. The only thing that requires counterblast is retiring stuff, that like the retiring stuff on your board, like with Blaster Dark, and the main, which is the draw, but they don't need it to keep the deck going. So something to keep in mind. You definitely don't need to conserve a Counter Blast, but sometimes swinging to rear guards isn't terrible. And yeah, like I said, it's all in the early game, and then later on it should start falling off. But anyway, yeah, give the homie some love. Very good video. I recommend watching this. But yeah, that's pretty much your top 10 decks. Just to kind of give you a quick rundown: Kyrie, Gravidia Worlds or Gravidia Pure, Prison, Bastion, Baro Magnus, Bob Sagara, though I don't think that deck is something I have to worry about, Bruce, both variants, Flagberg, and PBO. Those are the main decks to look out for.